they're trying to use words to talk about that which is utterly beyond personhood in a conventional sense.
Mhm.
So one way to do that is to say, okay, it's not personhood. So then you have the impersonal language. But then that's problematic as well. It sounds like we're talking about a stone or something. And then so then you have the personal language. And then there are people who are unsatisfied with that. In the Advaita tradition, it's like, yeah, but we're persons and persons have limits and but the point is we just really don't have language for this at all. So we have to take personhood and say, okay, well, we're talking about radical personhood. We're talking about something that goes utterly beyond personhood in the conventional sense. And it really is what you were just describing, Swamiji, a little while ago, just letting ourselves be utterly suffused with love and letting that force of unconditional love carry us and transform us.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Free Radical podcast. I had the pleasure today to meet with a dear friend, very special soul, Dr. Jeffery Long. Jeffery is a professor of religion, philosophy, and Asian studies at Elizabethtown College, Pennsylvania. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago Divinity School in the year 2000. He's the author, editor, and co-editor of 11 books, including Hinduism in America, A Convergence of Worlds, which won the Rajendra Anjoti Gandhi Award for Excellence in Theology, Philosophy, and Critical Reflection from the Dharma Academy of North America in 2022. Dr. Jeffery Long has also received an award from the International Ahimsa Foundation and an award for research excellence from Elizabethtown College. He has spoken 3 times in the United Nations and appears in documentaries for PBS and the History Channel. Dr. Long received initiation into the Vedanta tradition of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda in July 2005. He's a frequent speaker at Vedanta societies and Hindu temples in America. Here I'm sharing the contact info for those who would like to connect with him, which is longjd@etown.edu. So longjd@etown.edu. So it has been a journey, the conversation with Jeffery. It's an ongoing conversation we have been having for the last years, and we have been touching upon very interesting topics in connection with the parallels and connection and differences between Advaita Vedanta, Gaudiya Vedanta, other forms of Vedanta, the notion of process theology, or this idea that God is interconnected with everything in reality, and how God, love, and everyone else is in constant expansion and movement. We have talked about his next book on Ahimsa. He has shared with us his life story and how he connected to his own tradition, but by first being connected somehow with Gaudiya Vaishnavism in a very interesting way, and the lessons coming from pain in life, and how can pain and suffering open our heart to very interesting epiphanies, and so many other topics that I invite you to go through today. So this is the Free Radical podcast, and to support it, please subscribe to the channel by clicking the bell. If you feel nourished by the conversation, just like it, share it, and drop out any commentaries and thoughts and ideas you may like to share with us, so we can continue and keep this conversation alive. So without further ado, dear friends, brothers, sisters, with you, here is Dr. Jeffery Long. So Jeffery, thank you so much for joining us in the Free Radical podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. Namaste.
Namaste. Which is a very interesting word, by the way, right? Namaste, I always, because sometimes we may use the word casually, but namaste ultimately means a denial of my false self, so to say, and an acknowledging, or not only my real self, by the other person, no? Like not me, you, something like that, right?
It's very profound. Yeah, it's very profound, and we're honoring because this term, this namas or namaha, depending on the context, something we use in prayer. We offer namas to the
Namo
divine.
Namaha. Yeah.
Exactly. So when we're saying namaste, we're honoring that divine reality in the other person also. And so it's very profound. And I love this in this tradition that even hello is got some philosophical depth.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to take at least 1 minute to go to what namaste means, so we keep it on, we honor the term as it deserves. So
Yes, exactly.
yeah. So Jeffrey, generally I like to begin by recapitulating a little bit how me and my corresponding guests in every episode somehow or other get to know each other.
Mm-hmm.
Probably you have a way better memory than me. If you would like to do the recap and help all of us to recall how we met first time interaction. I mean, never in 3D yet. Looking forward for that, but we have had some one-dimensional and two-dimensional interesting interactions.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, we have yet to meet in person, but my memory is I think our first it started as a correspondence. That you had written this really fascinating book of Vaishnav theology, and it was about whether it was about inherited or inherent grace. And so and it's very, very carefully written, very attentive to the text. I was very impressed with this book. And you had asked me if I would be willing to, I think, write some kind of commentary on it. I believe I reviewed it on Amazon. I think
you wrote some endorsement to the book.
And an endorsement is actually there on the back of the book also, I believe. And so that is there. And then that led to just a series of email conversations about various topics of our shared interest. And your more recent book on Radical Personalism, and you sent me a copy of that. Thank you very much. And then we've one of the things that has come out of our conversation is a shared interest in what is broadly called process thinking, right? Process philosophy, process theology, which for those who people who are listeners to the podcast regularly probably have a good idea of it, but for those who maybe are relatively new to the field, I would define it most broadly as
and I plan to go, hopefully, to go there in detail later, but you can share a few words.
But you know, this idea that divinity itself is in process, right? There in many traditions, there's a tendency to want to think of God as static. And there are, of course, there are those aspects that are eternal and unchanging. But especially in Vaishnava traditions, and you see this in the Abrahamic religions as well, the divine reality is engaged in a relationship with the world and with all of us. So, and what's that all about? And we also discovered that we have some mutual friends and people with some of the same interests in the academy. So we've made connections there. People like from very senior people like Father Frank Clooney to
good friends. Had a video call with Patrick Baldio, remember?
Patrick Baldio, who has more recently entered the field, but already doing great work. And so, I think, we found a lot of common ground. And then most recently we had our shared conversation online with Sherry Kling from Process and Faith. And so, that it's just this wonderful conversation that's emerged over the last year or so. And I've enjoyed it. I hope you have too. You've invited me here, so
that's why you're here. That's why you're here.
Yes.
Yeah. It's an ongoing conversation that it's always going on again. It's a process. It's in process, so that's why I look forward to what we can share today.
Yes.
And I wanted, of course, to personally express gratitude for your more than generous endorsement to my first book. It was such a huge gift that most of the people who was helping me editing were like, okay, this endorsement has to be the first one in the whole book because this is too nice to put it in a second place. So the very first thing you find when you open Inherent or Inherited are your words, Jeffrey. So thank you so much for that.
Well, that's kind of you, because I hope the comments are worthy of the book. The book is really a great contribution, and like I said, I don't know if I mentioned this in one of our earlier conversations, but in the study of especially Hindu traditions in the academy has been heavily weighted toward more sort of sociological, anthropological, what you could probably call descriptive studies. And the kind of careful theological work that you see internal to traditions like the different branches of Christianity, for example, and that's very much an accepted part of the Western Academy, that is still undeveloped in as far as Hindu traditions go. And there are people doing excellent work in that field, like yourself, like Anantanan Rambachan. You know, there are quite a few others. I've made a little bit of a foray into that, but it was good to see, you know, this, you know, serious work of that kind being done internally to Hindu tradition. So when something good like that comes along, I want to encourage it and promote it as much as I can.
Thank you. Thank you for your encouragement and support since day one, book one, so far till today. We'll go there in detail, and I hope the book is up to the words you shared and not the other way around. So thank you.
Well, you know, yeah, the readers will have to decide, but I think anyone who's really engaged with these questions, I think, will enjoy that book.
Jeffrey, also I like to ask always my guests why you accepted to come to this episode. I mean, briefly, we mentioned already, okay, we are excited to continue the conversation, but there is something else you would like to add in terms of what has brought you here today, so to say.
Okay, so well, multiple things I would say have converged to bring me to this, and so I can talk in the more immediate sense of our friendship, our ongoing conversation. You know, if you're doing this excellent podcast, and I've seen some of the episodes, I like the topics you cover, so that makes me think, okay, I would love to be part of that because I have similar interests. To dig back deeper, several layers, I suppose. One is with, you know, we've already sort of mentioned process and how integral that is to the conversations you have here on this podcast. That this is a way of thinking that I think is very important. It illuminates aspects of theology, aspects of Hindu thought, aspects of Christian thought. And I know you've had thinkers from multiple traditions on the podcast, and one of my personal beliefs and something that is very central in the tradition in which I practice, which some viewers may be familiar with, the tradition of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda was one of the very first Hindu traditions to be brought to the United States. And so there's a long story of how I came to be affiliated with that particular tradition. But one of its key teachings is the idea of what we call harmony of religions. That's sort of an English translation of dharma samandaya. The idea that we have these many traditions. Of course, within Hindu tradition, we have many sampradayas, but then even looking more broadly at the world's religions, at the world's philosophies, at modern science, you know, all of these centers of knowledge, centers of wisdom, we could call them. And one thing I believe very deeply in is I call it, I'm using this term in a somewhat loose fashion. It's a philosophical term, but metaphysical realism, right? We're all in a world together. We're all experiencing certain realities. We're all part of this reality. And so inevitably we will describe it differently based on our culture, based on our vantage point in history, based on our personal experiences. And because I'm very much convinced of the idea of rebirth, whatever sanskaras, whatever past life impressions we're bringing into this world are going to shape how we describe our experience and how we understand our reality. So there will be difference, but because we're all part of this reality, we will find connections across traditions, across cultures, across sometimes what are often regarded as very divergent ways of thinking. We'll find actually different ways of getting insight into the same realities. And I sometimes use an analogy here with the physical sciences, that, you know, we're in a world. And so if we take something like gravity, for example, gravity is real. So it would have inevitably been discovered at some point by someone. But the way it might be described might be different. Is it a force of attraction that is inherent to objects? Is it curvature in the space-time continuum? Right? These are all different ways of describing gravity. But the phenomenon is there. And so if we think in terms of spiritual reality, say that there is such a thing as divinity, there is such a thing as soul, the values have a reality. They aren't simply arbitrary rules that human beings have created, then we'll discern those in our different ways. And if you look at across many traditions, you'll see those points of connection. Now, this is all a long and roundabout way of saying that I've seen process thought as a kind of bridge that enables us to make those connections and see those areas where traditions are describing divinity in, I think, very similar and mutually illuminating ways. So when you have someone like Teilhard de Chardin in the Catholic tradition talking about a kind of evolutionary process within the Godhead and including the world, then there's something very close to that in the Lila of the divine in the Vaishnava traditions, for example. So this is a topic that fascinates me a lot. Moving then to another level, I would say too that when we talk about harmony of religions, pluralism, finding common insights in different traditions, sometimes the biggest arguments are internal to traditions. And I know there's been a lot of, fortunately not blood spilled, but definitely a lot of ink spilled in the Hindu tradition between Vaishnava thinkers and Advaita Vedanta thinkers debating with one another and sort of finding things very problematic in the view of the other. And I think this is something else that is a bridge I would like to see built, where that there comes to be a deeper understanding that that these two perspectives, I think of them more as complementary than as mutually exclusive. And if some viewers might not agree, you have people who say, oh, those impersonalists, they don't know what they're talking about, right? And then you have, oh, those personalists, they don't know what they're talking about. It's like, well, really, they're talking about different aspects of a reality that is so vast that no single paradigm, I think, can encompass it fully. And so, while my tradition is often identified with Advaita Vedanta, and Swami Vivekananda used the terminology of Advaita Vedanta very often, if you look at his teaching, and then if you especially look at the teaching of Sri Ramakrishna, it's something a bit different. It's really an attempt to encompass all of these points of view and to see each of them as potentially grounding a sadhana, a practice that is effective, right? That people who follow the path of bhakti, they achieve their goal, right? People who follow the path of jnana, they achieve their goal. And it's really what the Gita teaches, right? Where Bhagavan Shri Krishna says, both come to me, right? So I think this is something really important to affirm, that not only harmony across religions, but a kind of fraternity within these Hindu traditions as well.
Thank you, Jeff. And you can imagine, as I was listening to you, I couldn't avoid thinking about one episode after another in my own tradition, in relation to other traditions, and in relation to our own tradition, in terms of maybe not blood spilled, as you say, but ink spilled and sweat spilled and emotion spilled interactions. Even my first book that you mentioned very generously, not everyone liked that from my own tradition, because I presented some particular point of view in which there is not absolute consensus. So also that created some interesting dynamics that even in my own life took to a very interesting unfolding of circumstances. That's a separate conversation, but it's interesting. Even you were mentioning some of the differences of opinion between Advaita Vedanta and other forms of Vedanta, but even among one particular school of Vedanta, I talk for my tradition, Gaudiya Vedanta, there are differences of opinion, and I've seen that many times. Unfortunately, most of us, we do not handle differences of opinion with much grace, so to say. And I remember one of the main intentions in writing my first book, and I wrote that in the introduction, was trying to, even this may sound like a controversial topic, what I was talking about, and knowing that many people may disagree with it, I'm trying to present a topic with some particular support from scripture and common sense and so on and so forth. And even if you disagree, let's bring the topic to the table and let's have I don't know if to call it culture of debate, but let's create a culture of disagreement in the context of mature, healthy conversation and learning to love each other, even when we disagree with one another. So I appreciate your point because it has been something very close to my own experience. And I appreciate also that you mentioned, and I want to go in a minute to a little bit to a short introduction to where you come from in the sense of how you connected with Hinduism and so on.
Right.
But
Sure.
I appreciate your mentioning of the particular lineage you are affiliated with and how it's generally identified with Advaita Vedanta. And I can imagine at this moment, even some people from my own tradition saying like, what are you doing, Swami Padmanabha, inviting someone affiliated with Advaita Vedanta? Though they are our archive enemies. So
Exactly.
because as you properly say, then no, there has been some historical back and forth in both directions. And I acknowledge that back and forth historically, but I also acknowledge the need for another level of conversation and bridge building and acknowledgement, as you properly mentioned. And I totally agree that even if someone comes and tells me, Swami, I long for the goal of Advaita Vedanta through the process of Gyan. I'm trying to enter Brahma Sayuja, Nirvishesh Brahman, however you may like to call it. But I also acknowledge that if you would like to eternally serve Krishna in bhakti, in a personal relationship with him, that's a valid option, although that's not my cup of tea. But I totally acknowledge that. So there's place for that, as you mentioned. That's mentioned in scriptures. It's not that only my goal is the only possible one and every other person, because this misunderstanding is also in our tradition. In some places, at least, not in the scriptures, but in some practitioners, that if you, so to say, choose to go to Brahman, let's say Brahma Sayuja, if you want to put it that way, the goal of Gyan, that's not an eternal goal. And if you reach there, eventually you will fall from there until you reach a personalistic goal, so to say. But actually, that's not correct. No, actually, the scriptures describe in our own one of our main texts, the Srimad Bhagavatam, as you may know, there is this famous verse, Madanti tat tattva vidam tatpas jnanabhayam brahmeti paramatmeti bhagavaniti shabdyate. It describes, it interestingly uses the word tattva to refer to reality and God. Like God is another name for reality. And that reality expresses itself as Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. So immediately from the onset, it's validating that particular portal, although it may not be our chosen approach to that unlimited infinite.
That's right.
It's a valid one. And in our tradition, over and over again, we have very beautiful things. And I'm not saying this to you, I'm saying this more to my listeners.
Right.
You know that very well. But there are many verses in our tradition who say every person will feel that every devotee or every practitioner will feel their approach to the infinite is the best.
Right.
And everyone is correct. Basically.
Right. Exactly. And if we didn't feel that, we wouldn't choose that approach, right? This is always, my students who become sort of put off by all forms of religion. Say, well, everyone thinks theirs is the best, and that's seen as a kind of snobbery. It's like, well, it's more like, and in fact, I have a Buddhist friend who gave a wonderful metaphor for this. He said it's more like being married, that you love your spouse, so presumably you see your spouse as the best person in the world, but you don't think everyone should be married to your spouse. Your spouse is your spouse, and they should feel the same way about their spouse, right? And so that religion is like that. That you that when it works, right? When a tradition really grabs you, and you really find that this is my home, this is where I'm meant to be intellectually, spiritually. The mistake we make is then assuming that has to apply to everyone has to be here where I am. It's like, no, it might get very crowded. It would be good if people have their spiritual home. The Lord's abode is vast, right? So there's that phrase from the Christian tradition. There are many mansions in my house, right? So,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I will add to that if we have the tendency of everyone should be in my house, so to say, or everyone should affiliate with my particular lineage, many times, I'm not saying always, but many times it has more to do with my own lack of faith in terms of I need to see the whole world doing what I'm doing, so they convince me that I'm in the right place, so to say.
Right, because people feel insecure when they
Yeah,
encounter otherness.
exactly.
Oh,
Although externally it may sound they have a strong faith and they are very convincing to everyone, but actually internally they are very fragile and insecure, as you mentioned. So yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate that mentioning of this point. So as I mentioned, Jeffrey, if you will like, I'm interested in, I mean, I know a little bit more, but I'm interested in that my audience knows a little bit more about you. Where is your background? Of course, you're a scholar, you're a practitioner, you're connected with a particular phase of Sanatan Dharma, so to say. But how was your beginning? A little brief sketch of your life. If I'm not mistaken, I think Gaudiya Vaishnavism was quite instrumental
yeah.
in your journey toward your particular present situation and present faith and practice. So if you will, share with us a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. It was indeed. Gaudiya Vaishnavism played a big role in my path, and that's why I think I'm so sympathetic to, building bridges and really, not seeing Gaudiya Vaishnavism as something completely other from myself. I don't think it's been very integral, actually. So I started out actually in the Catholic tradition of Christianity. So I grew up in the U.S. in a small town in Missouri. And I was, I would say, devout but independent minded. And my whole family, I think, was like that. My father, in fact, went to seminary for 1 year in high school and was intent on being a priest, and then decided after 1 year, he's like, nope, this is not for me. So I went back to the regular, public high school and met my mother, and they got married right out of high school, and they didn't go to college. My mother did later on, but that's kind of part of the story. My father was in an accident when I was 10 years old, and it left him paralyzed basically from the neck and the shoulders on down, what they call quadriplegic. He couldn't move his arms or legs. And so he was in the hospital and in rehabilitation centers for several months. And then we brought him home and we took care of him. We cared for him at home. But when I was 12 years old, he passed away. As a result of, I mean, I won't tell the whole story here because it would take us away from our main topic. But I can say briefly that it was a period of profound suffering for of course, my father, my mother, my family. We were a small family. Just I was the only child, but the extended family was very large. We had a lot of cousins, aunts and uncles, grandparents, and so on. So, and being a small town, everyone knew everybody. So our whole community was really shaken by what happened. And so I think of this moment as there are times in our lives when the fabric of our life is torn, you could say, and it's very painful, it's very traumatic, but you could say that through that tear divine grace comes. And this is what I found, because I had to rely on the divine reality in order to survive mentally everything that happened. And so several things I learned during that time. One was how to meditate, which I didn't use the word meditation for it, but just before my father's accident, really just a few months before, there was a Catholic nun who was teaching in a summer course that I attended. It was our catechism course. So she was very grandmotherly, very kind, and I felt very comfortable asking her questions. And so I said once, Sister, why is it that we talk to God, and but God doesn't answer back? God doesn't talk to us like, in the Bible. And why is that? And I expected her to say, oh, it's a test of faith, or you're not praying hard enough, or, sort of standard Catholic answers that you might receive. But she said something that was very profound. She said, when I said, why doesn't God talk back to us? She said, if you listen closely enough, he does. And that
I was thinking something like that, because you are not listening, or something to that effect.
Exactly. If you listen carefully enough, he does. So I began the practice of what I called listening. I would say my prayers, and then I would just quiet my mind and listen. And what happened was, basically it worked. Not that I heard a booming voice, commanding me to, do anything, but sometimes during that listening, or maybe later that day or a few days later, the answer to the question or the concern that I had brought to prayer would appear to me. Right? I would get a sense of oh, that's the answer to that problem. And it always had a different character from something I would generate myself, right? There were, I knew how to, solve problems and think things through and come up with answers, but this felt different, right? And there was always this sense when I would get this awareness that it was something I already knew but had forgotten. So there was this sense of recognition that would come, and when I would sense what I would call the presence of divinity, it was loving and gentle, but it was always a little bit humorous too, as if God found my questions kind of funny for some reason. I don't know. That was how I felt at the time. And so I would say I developed at an early age a propensity toward spiritual life, prayer, meditation. Again, I learned the term meditation later on, but this practice of listening was there. But in terms of my thinking, I was not particularly orthodox. I was very independent-minded. So after my father died, especially, I became very preoccupied with the question of what happens to us next, or what happens after we die. And of course, in the Catholic Church, we had the teaching of heaven and hell, and then this additional concept of purgatory. And the concept of purgatory made a lot of sense to me in one perspective, because well, the late philosopher John Hick said it very beautifully. He said, I don't know anyone who's good enough to go to heaven or bad enough to go to hell." Right? This whole idea that you have one short lifetime, which is just a microcosmic, this brief flash of time on the basis of which all of eternity is decided. That just didn't make sense to me, right? Because purgatory
I wonder how much you relate purgatory with the notion of karma and reincarnation.
Well, precisely. That was the bridge for me to karma and reincarnation, because purgatory made sense, because the doctrine of purgatory, which you don't find in all Christian traditions, but the Catholic Church teaches it, that when you die, you're not perfect yet, but if you're in a state of grace, as the Church says it, if you're, as we would say, maybe you're on the path, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to be condemned. You're going to eventually reach the ultimate goal, but you still have some work to do, right? And so the term purgatory, it's cognate with this word purge or purgation, right? You're getting rid of the imperfections there. And the question I had about that was, if we still have all this work to do after we pass on, because my father wasn't perfect, people I knew who had died, they were good people, but they weren't perfect, right? So what was the purpose of this life? And I started thinking, maybe we're already in purgatory. Maybe this is purgatory. In fact, maybe we lived before and died, and here we are, and we're still continuing. And maybe we just keep coming back until we figure it out. And
that was the beginning of your process thought, no?
Process thought, and thinking much more in a dharmic way of thinking than an Abrahamic way of thinking about the afterlife. Though I've since learned in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there are traditions that affirm the idea of rebirth, but at least in Christianity and Islam, they're not really the mainstream, and the idea has been rejected a lot. But Judaism, they're very open to it. It's like, in fact, I have a lot of Jewish students who say, well, you can believe whatever you want about the afterlife in Judaism. You can believe there's no afterlife. All of it is there.
Yeah, but recently I had a podcast with the two rabbis, and basically they say the exact same thing you mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I was very drawn to the idea that there's some kind of afterlife, because the idea that we would suffer so much in this world as we do, and then just die and that's it, just struck me as very cruel and meaningless. And of course, there are people who will tell you, well, we live in a cruel and meaningless universe. I choose not to believe that. I reject that. In fact, William James is another philosopher who's influenced me a lot, and he basically his thesis was that if your beliefs don't clash with our scientific knowledge to any great extent, but they go beyond what the scope of science, that's perfectly fine. You're free to believe those things if believing them makes you a better person and gives you a purpose and a sense of that life has meaning and it gives you joy. Go ahead and believe it. So I choose to believe that. And so the model that started to make sense to me was this idea of karma and rebirth. Now, again, just like meditation, I didn't know the terms karma and rebirth yet. I had heard the word reincarnation once. There was a TV show about it that I had seen. But this, what the next thing that happened, here's where the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition really, I think, comes in. Two things that influenced me a lot were from Western popular culture. I saw the movie Gandhi when I was 13. And that made a big impression on me. I started reading anything I could find on Gandhi. I mean, the whole idea of resisting evil, but through peaceful means, I thought was a very powerful thing. And he referred frequently to the Bhagavad Gita.
Yeah.
And then another popular culture source was I was and remain a big fan of the Beatles and their music, and George Harrison especially, and his spiritual quest. He was very close to Srila Prabhupada, as you know, and he, helped promote the Hare Krishna movement. He gave them his house in London to be a temple, right? So, so that intrigued me, and he would refer in his song lyrics and in album cover art and so on to the Bhagavad Gita. So I kept thinking, I need to read this Bhagavad Gita. This seems like an important book. And around that time, I was about 14 by this time, I went to a open air market, what we call a flea market, in a local church. It was the Methodist church in the town where I grew up. And I went with my grandmother because she used to make a lot of arts and crafts and sell these things. So I would help her, but I would also go and buy like old comic books and science fiction novels and things that at these markets that people were giving away or selling for very cheap. So I came to this table that had a lot of books and magazines on it. I thought, okay, there'll be something interesting there. And on the very top was a copy of the Bhagavad Gita. And it was the Prabhupada translation, Bhagavad Gita as it is, with the beautiful illustrations. I opened it, and the first page I turned to was a painting of a man who has recently died. He's surrounded by his family. They're all deep in mourning. And nearby, there's a sage who looks like you, standing a few feet away, and looking very, compassionately at this group. And he's gifted with the ability to see God in all of them. So there's this little Krishna in the heart of every one of them. And then at the bottom, it said, the wise lament neither the living nor the dead. And it gave a page number. This grabbed me immediately because I saw myself in that family, right? That man, and his family, that was like my father and all of us. So I turned to the page, and of course, it's Krishna explaining in the second chapter to Arjuna that we don't really die. Changing bodies is like changing clothes. The wise are not deceived by these changes. It was so reassuring, and it was so, and it fits so well with what I just thought of as my own theory of Catholicism, which no one else seemed to like in my community, but it fit that perfectly. And there was a sensation I experienced, and years later, I finally came up with a way to kind of put it into words. It was like being an extraterrestrial who was raised by humans and then finding an artifact from your home planet, right? And it's like, this connects with me, right? And this makes sense. It made so much more sense than anything else. And I loved the illustrations, the pictures, and I immediately, of course, bought the book, and just for 25 cents, bought the book. And that was really a big part of my journey, reading the Gita. And I've had people who've asked, because you read Prabhupada's Gita first, why didn't you go into Gaudiya Vaishnava? And I was already chanting Hare Krishna. I'd learned that from George Harrison. I was already, reading his book and so on. But what happened is it was like an explosion of interest. So I started reading everything. I started reading. Within a couple of years, I had accumulated 6 different translations of the Gita by various authors. Reading the Upanishads, reading Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi, Aldous Huxley's Perennial Philosophy, Swami Rama's Living with the Himalayan Masters. I mean, if it was from India, I wanted to read it. And so what I ended up doing was, like that Gita was the beginning, but it was sort of like the seed from which everything else grew. And so yeah, and I didn't even just limit myself to Hinduism. I was reading about Buddhism, I was reading about Taoism, um, and at the time, I wasn't thinking in terms of changing my religious identity. I just wanted to know the answers to these questions. And the answers that made most sense to me were what I was finding in the Hindu texts and Hindu teachings of Hindu masters. But I was still a good Catholic boy. I was still going to mass, and I delved more deeply into Catholicism too. And we had a priest who encouraged my interest. So he lent me his books on Saint Thomas Aquinas, Saint Augustine. I started delving into some heavy duty Catholic theology, and I learned a lot. And I feel that I gained from something wise from all of the books I read, everything that I encountered. But I kept coming back to the Gita because like that just made sense. And so that has become, Vedanta, really, Vedanta in a broad sense has become really that is my worldview. And in fact, I've even had some interesting conversations with people about, there's this question, do you have to be born Hindu, or can you be Hindu by choice? And I would always say, well, of course, by choice, because I've found this and I agree with it and I'm following it. But then I think, in a way, maybe I was born with this, because what happened was I already had certain ideas, and then I found it confirmed here, right? But if I had not come across the Gita, I'd just be a weird Catholic who believes in reincarnation. I would be believing and living much the same way, but because of Hindu tradition, I've been able to deepen all of this much more. Of course, now I've and I decided to make my living by studying these things and writing about it, talking about it. I just think it's a wonderful privilege to be able to do that. I mean, so many people aren't able to do the thing they enjoy, or they don't even have a job, right? So I took advantage of whatever opportunities I had. I went to University of Notre Dame for college, went to University of Chicago for graduate school, met my wife in Chicago, who's also a scholar and scholar of Japanese. And then we ended up in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. I was so busy in graduate school that in one sense, I won't say I neglected spiritual life, because I was studying these things all the time. But the studying is not the same as doing sadhana, right? It can be a sadhana. But when my wife and I both left Chicago and came to Pennsylvania, and we're working here, we found we had more time to really delve into spiritual life more. And we started being more regular in practicing things like meditation, going to our temple. And that is how we made our connection with the Vedanta Society. And I spoke at a conference in 2003, and it was on Swami Vivekananda's voyage to the West. And Swami Vivekananda was someone who I admired and whose teaching I felt drawn to. But we weren't yet established in that, I would say. And so I went to the conference, and what happened to me at the conference was there were a lot of really good scholars there. And I had, I think, maybe kind of a prejudice, just coming from graduate school, that the really interesting presentations would be the ones by the professors, by the scholars. And there were 4 or 5 swamis there also, and the Pravajika was there. And they were also speaking, and I think I assumed that they would basically, they would offer some prayers, they would say some nice things about Swami Vivekananda, but that would be it. But I have to tell you, the most profound, the most scholarly, the absolute best presentations at that conference were the ones by the Swamis and the Pravajikas. They were at the same level academically as the professors, maybe even beyond it in some respects, but then also brought the additional, the experiential side. And one of the speakers would eventually become our guru. We would take initiation into the tradition with him, and he's still our guide to the present day, and always will be. And we formed a very deep personal connection with the tradition. So I'm now very involved. I speak regularly at centers. If the Swamis have to go somewhere else, they call me and say, come
Okay.
give a talk. So I've spoken in New York and DC, Boston, a few other places as well. Most recently, I spoke in Chicago at the invitation of Swami Shatmananda, who was there. He was there for that presentation, and so yeah, it's become my life, and I'm grateful. And it's a strange thing to say because it was such an experience of suffering. It was so difficult, but there's a sense in which I'm grateful for the difficult time I went through as a child because it led me here.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It's so I'm overwhelmed in one sense in terms of how much your journey resembles mine, and not wanting to talk about me and to reduce your journey to mine, so to say.
I'd love to
And
hear
of
about
course,
yours too. Yeah.
it's not, and I'm wanting to go into the details of that now, but and it happens more than once, but I really felt very connected with, I don't know, examples like the ones. Of course, I didn't went through that complexity that you went through with your father, but somehow I had my own situation with my father when he got divorced from my mom when I was young, and that threw me into a very interesting, so to say, period of pain and suffering and bewilderment and disconcertment and existential crisis and through suffering. And I really appreciate your point, through suffering, like Leonard Cohen says in his anthem song, like it is through the crack that the light gets in.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So the importance of some brokenness into our life story to allow the heart to open sometimes. Sometimes the heart remains shattered and closed or complacent or numbed unless big love or big suffering knocks on our door. So I really appreciate your emphasis on how pain and suffering have a redemptive power and a redemptive intention, I would say, ultimately, just since if we believe at least that reality and life is not conspiring against us, that the world is not against us, but everything is trying to conspire in a positive way to create the best for us. So if a painful situation is happening for whatever reason, there is the potential at least to draw so much insight and so much growth and maturation, even with pain included, of course.
Yes.
So I appreciate, thank you so much for that. And I'm recalling some of the things you mentioned. I appreciate what the nun told you about listening and how much you emphasize listening in connection to, of course, meditation, but also prayer, since sometimes we do not connect all of this, and listening is such a crucial and complex art for most of us, especially I would say in nowadays times where listening is not precisely the most valued asset. Everything's so fast, so quick, so brief, so superficial. But deep listening, contemplative attention, and presence is something that we need to culture with discipline in our sadhana. So I really appreciate that. In our tradition, we'll say always Shravan first, Shravan Kirtanam first, listening. And sometimes we may think, okay, listening means to listen to sacred discourses on the divine, which of course it's part of that, or listening to the name of God, or listening to saintly people, but also listening in prayer, listening to each other when we are interacting, listening to God coming to us as our life in the daily circumstances. If we don't have the ear to listen, as the nun said, he's speaking, but we are not listening. He's there, but we are not there. No, like sometimes I like to say, God is omnipresent, and sometimes we don't find, we feel he's not here, he's not present, although he's omnipresent. So instead of asking him, where are you, why you left, it's like, where am I? That I'm not finding you. You are omnipresent. As if I cannot find someone who is omnipresent, then I'm omni-absent, as I like to say.
Swami Vivekananda has a wonderful expression. He says, we are like children who have placed our hands over our eyes, and we're crying out, it's dark, it's dark.
Yeah. And if you play that game long enough, so to say, whenever you even if you take out the hands and see the light, you will say, oh, light is painful. Right? Let's go to the dark that is not as painful. So good. And I really appreciate the point you made on reincarnation as a we can say as a long purgatory. Now, I've had a few conversations with Father Richard Rohr in that connection. And we were trying like to connect these two ideas. Now, okay, karma, reincarnation, as a long purgatory, and in that way accommodate the
Mhm.
expression of purgatory itself. Because I was talking to him and to other Christians saying, like, hey, if you don't believe in purgatory or karma reincarnation, you just think, okay, eternal hell, eternal heaven.
Mhm.
So, and if you are a Christian, but there are different degrees of being a Christian, as you mentioned, some will be saints and perfect being, and some others will be half-baked, so to say,
That's right.
sadhakas.
Yeah.
So even if you just believe in Jesus or whatever, and you are already saved, but not even becoming more advanced, then why the emphasis to practice from a more substantial place? No, like
Exactly.
that always I thought, like, why in some of the Christian messages you are trying to invite Christianity or any other tradition, of course,
Mhm.
be more substantial. Do not practice from a very superficial place. If you will think just by believing in this you are all safe, going to the same place.
Right.
So yeah, for me, of course, the idea of karma reincarnation and purgatory as a long one makes total sense.
Yeah.
And of course I totally connect what you mentioned about your Gita epiphany, Bhagavad Gita epiphany. I also had that before and after with Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita. I
Wonderful.
also read. I was also a fan of the Beatles and George Harrison. I will read Aldous Huxley so much as well. So many parallels. So I'm very happy to hear a life story, and thanks for sharing that with us. So where to go now, Jeff? I have different ideas in mind. Uh, One question that also I like to ask many of my guests, and in connection to your life story, to where you have been, to the particular affiliation, we have been talking a little bit about Advaita Vedanta, about different goals and approaches to the divine.
Yes.
So I'd like to ask you a more personal question, but who God is for you today? Not
Hmm.
yesterday, not tomorrow. Today, at this point of your journey.
Today,
Again,
at this point,
open to the idea of God being in process and we being in process along with God. So just wanting to know what's the particular uh, not definition even, but what will you say in that connection today?
oh, that's a wonderful, wonderfully profound question. And for me, who is God for me? Uh, if I were just simply to
Yeah.
start associating words, right,
Mhm.
with feelings, and I would say friend, I would
Mhm.
say guide, um, the form of divinity, if we think in terms of Hindu traditions, and this is very appropriate in the Ramakrishna tradition, I tend to think of God more as mother, I would say, than as father. For me, there's something very motherly, very maternal about God. Even if you think in terms of something like childbirth, like are these physical bodies that we identify with, these physical vehicles, came from the body of our mother, right? It was not something manufactured or made from some external substance. It
Mhm.
came from her body, and that's very much how I think of this cosmos and all of us as we and of course, we get into some of these issues of Advaita and Vaishnava interpretations, but for me, it's very much both and that we are of the essence of that
Mhm.
divine mother. At the same time, we are distinct from the divine
Mhm.
mother. I am not right now personally sustaining the whole universe. I'm just me here,
Mhm.
and yet there is that in me which is of that nature, right? That sense of
Mhm.
being something much greater than this physical form or than just the total events of our lives. And so God for me is that. And God for me is like a vast ocean or a vast stream or river that is sort of carrying all of us toward a destination.
Mhm.
And we can swim against the current, and then
Mhm.
our lives are going to be very difficult.
Mhm.
And we are not going to be very happy, but we might think, okay, there's something attractive in that direction. I want to swim that way. Or
Mhm.
then we can eventually surrender, right, a very important term in Vaishnava tradition, and say, no, I'm going to let your current carry me where it will, because there is much more wisdom in that divine current than just in me. So I'm going to trust and be open to what you have to show me. Uh, I think of the divine reality. I think of God as a protector. Also, I can think of many times in my life when some alternative might have occurred that would have been very bad for me, and I feel that I was protected from that. that there were things that have happened that, and of course, if you're skeptical, you can say, well, those are coincidences, but those coincidences pile up after a while.
Yeah.
And they pile up to such an extent that it becomes really much more plausible to say that there's a real phenomenon here than that it's just coincidences. So
Yeah.
I see myself as being, I think if we think of God as a mother, but then also in a certain sense as this river that's carrying us all forward, and that if we surrender to it, if we let it carry us, that's the best thing we can do. And so that's I think the best I could describe the relationship is like that. And it's learning to my struggle, I would say, in life has been, learning to trust that and be open to that and just let go, and not, because I come from a long lineage of worriers. My mother, my grandmother, going back, worry about things. Whenever my wife and I would travel, my grandmother, unfortunately, she left her body about 9 years ago. But before that, whenever we would travel anywhere, we would have to contact her and inform her that we had arrived safely, or she would worry. And my mother would tell me, you have to call her and she has to hear your voice because she's going to worry otherwise. And so I have that.
My mom.
Yeah. So, but then I also think that too, that not that God worries, because God knows there's nothing to worry about, but that love that worry comes from, that I see, that's the Divine Mother, right? That's that mothering force in the universe that wants us to be okay. And sometimes we get tested and we suffer and we have problems, but none of that there's no malice in that, right? There's no malice in God. I'm very unhappy when I hear someone uses the phrase, "Oh, God hates this" or "God hates that." I think there's no hate in God. It's just love.
God is love. Yeah.
God is love. God is love, and everything else is our own misunderstanding, I think.
Great, that's a good one. God is love, and everything else is our own misunderstanding of that fact. Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, we were saying God, love, the nature of love is it cannot become its opposite. It can only increase its own nature. So love can only become further love. So if God is love, he can only become more of that and never turn to hate or stuff like that.
Exactly.
But yeah, you did very well, Jeff, with my surprise question. Sorry, I know it's not a simple question. Like, okay, tell me where you live, but who is God for you today? Even that's more complicated. If I ask you, give me a definition of love. But if I say, who is God for you today? That's radically personal, and we are going there in a minute. So thank you for taking up the challenge. And I totally appreciate the particular directions you went in, like God as a friend, God as a protector, God as a mother. This important point that we have to be careful with how we frame God in terms of gender, so to say, and even when we say female, male, mother, father, what do we understand by that? How much there is no childhood projection on whatever experiences we have with authority figures. For us, all those points are so important also in our tradition, that to see God, to feel God as a friend, to know that he's with us, for us, he loves us unconditionally. In fact, you gave this idea of ocean, God as an ocean, and we have this name for Krishna called Karuna Sindhu, which means basically an ocean of grace, an ocean of mercy. And I really like what you mentioned in that connection. It adds further layers to this name, which is, okay, we are in that ocean, but it's up to us to allow the waves to carry us or swim against it and with our own particular objective. So the ocean is there, but what we are doing in the ocean, we have the role to play in the ocean. And trying. Yeah, the other day I was talking with a friend of mine who was telling me, if you are in the ocean, if you don't know how to swim, you can just put yourself like in a horizontal perspective, floating and looking up to the sky, and you won't drown. But if you take any other stance, you will drown. No,
That's right.
So that floating upwards, so to say, was meant for me like this idea of, okay, surrender. No? And I'm looking upwards and I'm being carried by those waves of the ocean of mercy, trusting, as you say, God is my protector. In our tradition, and you mentioned the word surrender, we have this six-fold expression of surrender or saranagati, and the main one is Goptritve Varanam, which basically means accepting that God is protecting me, accepting that God is maintaining me, So I appreciate that you mentioned that, and as you mentioned also, trusting that the river, the curse of the river and the ocean is always in our favor. It's not that there's some bad intention going out, but it's just us missing the mark, as they will say in Christianity, sinning, hamartia, which means an archery, to miss the mark. We can try again. The other day I was talking with the rabbi. I have to mention this example he gave. I really like it. Simple but very important. With the GPS. Now he said, like, it's like if I'm driving and the GPS tells me go on the right here and I go on the left, immediately the GPS will say recalculating.
Yes.
So it will try to provide me the best possible scenario according to my worst possible choice that I've made.
Yes.
So that's how God, love, and reality operates. I may miss the mark again. I may turn into the wrong direction. Immediately, everything is recalculating to offer the best possible scenario I can have to learn what I have to learn at that particular point. So thank you for saying that, and thank you for making that point of we have to go beyond warriors. I appreciate that, warriors. Don't worry. Krishna, the beginning of the Gita, says to Arjuna, don't worry, don't fear, and at the end, in the conclusion, the same thing, masachaha. Don't worry, don't fear. So and I think in the Bible someone told me that's been said like 140 something times also, like don't worry, don't fear. They know Arjuna was a warrior, but we were a warrior.
Warriors, yes, warriors rather than warriors. Yeah, exactly. I just want another aspect of this I think that's important is one of the reasons I'd always sort of recoiled from the idea of any kind of eternal damnation is that it implies that God's love is finite, that you can reach a point beyond which God says, okay, I give up. You're on your own now. And I just don't think that happens. I don't think that's really correct. Now, we can keep making really bad choices for a very long time. Our tradition talks about, there are hells, right? There's Narak, right? But it's not forever and ever. It's till we open our eyes. It's till we surrender to that grace.
And the hell, if you want to call it hell or whatever, involution or lower planetary system, whatever we may like to call it, it's all in the spirit, in an educational spirit, right? It's not just mere chastisement and revenge and suffering, but for us to go through as I like to present it and conceive it, is we need to go through that so we learn to take proper responsibility for our actions. So eventually we become prepared to the ultimate responsibility, which is a life of love. So at least from my devotional perspective, I will say, okay, love is the ultimate goal of life, and love entails the highest responsibility. So for us to be prepared to train that muscle, even when we choose the worst possible thing, as you say, we may need to go through apparently horrible situations, but all of them from the bigger picture are to train us in responsibility, so eventually we can really deal with love successfully, so to say.
Right. It's not out of some malice or hatred or anything of that kind.
No. Jeffrey, you also have been, for a moment, going there, if you allow me. You have been, as already we have seen, big supporter of my first book, and thank you so much for that. Also, you have been big supporter of my second book, Radical Personalism. And I really appreciate that. I saw recently some article you wrote for the Journal of Vaishnava Studies, maybe some time ago already. You referred to that in one section of your article. So as I ask you, who is God for you today, I would like to ask you, what's radical personalism for you?
Okay. Very good question.
And why you liked the concept radical personalism. What touched you in particular, and what does it mean to you personally, since we are talking about radical personalism?
Well, for me, what radical personalism has, it's given me a new terminology, I think, to think about this particular question that has tended to divide our traditions, in which, one very basic question, like when you were saying, like, what is God for you today? One question that these traditions ask and answers, is God a person? Is God a person, or is God not a person? And of course, in the Vaishnava traditions, the answer is yes, God is a person, right? The supreme person, the supreme personality of Godhead. And the Advaita tradition, it's been often characterized as impersonal, and there are writers and thinkers who will use that term. I say impersonal. And so why why do they say impersonal in Advaita?
Mhm.
And I think that and again, this is my interpretation of it. I'm not claiming to be an authoritative speaker, but based on what I've studied, Shankaracharya right up to Swami Vivekananda, and then even post Swami Vivekananda, right, present day thinkers that talk about non-duality and so forth. That if we say impersonal in our conventional speech, it means something less than a person. So an object, right? And we'll have their Advaita thinkers who will use when they're writing in English, they'll use the pronoun it, right? Maybe it with a capital I, to talk about Brahman, right? To talk about ultimate reality. And I think that for many people, and certainly within the Vaishnava traditions, it's like, how can the supreme reality be something less than what I am, right? I'm a person. Like, a person is more than an object, right? A person is something more. My understanding, my interpretation of what they're trying to say in the Advaita tradition is that what we're talking about is vastly more than a person as we normally experience a person. And an infinite person, an ultimate, Purushottama, right? The ultimate person. And so that personal language, in a certain sense, fails to really capture that, because it's so much more than personhood as we tend to think of it. And so you have terms sometimes like transpersonal, like people talk about trans psychology and so on. And what I really like about the idea of radical personalism is what I see you as saying is that it's not that God is not personal, it's God is even more personal than we persons are, right? There is, if you can take personality to an infinite degree.
Yeah, that's what he called the supreme, as you said, the supreme personality of Godhead.
Exactly, the supreme personality. So, and here's where people may disagree with me, or maybe I'm going out on a limb by myself. I think they're saying the same thing ultimately. And they're not saying the same thing. That's too simplistic. But they're trying to use words to talk about that which is utterly beyond personhood in a conventional sense. So one way to do that is to say, okay, it's not personhood. So then you have the impersonal language. But then that's problematic as well. It sounds like we're talking about a stone or something. And then you have the personal language. And then there are people who are unsatisfied with that. In the Advaita tradition, it's like, yeah, but we're persons, and persons have limits, and but the point is, we just really don't have language for this at all. So we have to take personhood and say, okay, well, we're talking about radical personhood. We're talking about something that goes utterly beyond personhood in the conventional sense. And it really is what you were just describing, Swamiji, a little while ago, just letting ourselves be utterly suffused with love, and letting that force of unconditional love carry us and transform us. And that's really, it's radical personhood. It's taking our inherent or inherited relationality and connectedness with all beings to the nth degree. But I don't think that is ultimately different from what non-duality is aspiring to, because there are also writers and people like Swami Vivekananda who talk about non-duality in terms of a oneness, right? That we're one. And I once heard a talk by a Buddhist teacher, and that's definitely what we would call an impersonalist tradition. But he was saying there is no greater love than realizing that you are empty, I am empty, we are both empty, therefore we are both one, right? And they have, of course, a very special meaning of what they mean by empty. And again, it sounds very impersonal, it sounds very negative, but it means something so utterly beyond language that let's just not call it anything. That seems to be the Buddhist approach, right? We're going to call it what it is not, right? So I think what has getting in the reason so much ink and sweat and thankfully not blood has been spilled over these issues is because we just don't have the language to talk about the infinite. It is utterly beyond. And what I see, what I really like about your idea of radical personhood and radical personalism that you expressed in your book is that it's taking the personal language. It's taking, okay, this is where I stand. This is my tradition. I'm in this Vaishnava tradition. and carrying that to its highest possible degree, right? And thinking through the implications of it in terms of how we human beings, right now we're in human form, how we exist together in a community of love. How do we do that? And we don't do that by denying our personhood, right? We do that by embracing it more fully than actually conventional society does.
Yeah.
So it's like one tradition does this by saying, okay, this conventional society is not enough, I'm just going to renounce it utterly. And then another is to say, let's embrace it fully. But I think that it's almost like these two ends of the spectrum meet like a circle at the destination.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate your take on radical personalism and the elaboration you've shared. It's a very nuanced and perspective that it's not usual that I hear, because I ask lots of people, okay, so what's radical personalism for you? Because I always like to get newer insights and bigger picture of what I think it is. And I'm always surprised to receive some new insights like the one coming now. And I appreciate your point of mentioning how in Advaita traditions there may speak about impersonal in terms of, according to your feeling and reading of it, something that actually lies beyond mere personhood as we understand it. And in that sense, how we may be saying something similar from our point of view.
Right.
And in our tradition, we'll acknowledge so many sections in the Upanishads and so on, which says God has no body, God has no form, but we will be quick to explain in our lens, he has no body and form as we think of it.
Right.
So it's kind of the similar thing you are saying, no? Like when someone says it's impersonal, he's not a person as we think a person is, but it's way more than that. And the point that you mentioned, and we always reach this limit with language. Like, okay, we have words, we are trying to say as much as we can, like the Vedanta says, ikshate na shabdat. At one point, you cannot say anything. You can say anything about the infinite, or you can try your best and keep for eternity saying something and singing her glories, but still it's never enough. So yeah, many times some of our daily, crusades, theological crusades, many times online nowadays are many on this grammatical arena, so to say, of which word we use and what we understand by that. Like when you mentioned the emptiness of Buddhism, and very quickly we may be quick, especially Gaudiya Vaishnavism may be quick to point at that and say that's emptiness. We want fullness. Who wants emptiness?
Right.
But there's a way to talk about emptiness that, like Francis will talk even about poverty, or we can speak about surrender, emptying our. There's a way to talk about emptiness that is fulfilling, is full, is positive,
empty of ego, empty of ignorance, empty of pride, and this also makes me think of a great thinker from the tradition you and I both started with in this life, Thomas Aquinas. He says that all of our talk of God is analogy. So we say God is good. Well, yes, God is good. That's more true than saying God is evil, but God is much, God's goodness is vastly beyond what we think of as, well, this is a good person. Or even more superficially, well, this was a good loaf of bread, or something like that. It's vastly more. And he says the only thing we can literally say about God that's true is God exists. That's it. And beyond that, it's all analogy.
Yeah, and we will say, of course, there are scripture. We believe in revelation, but also the scripture and the revelation and the sacred texts are hinting or giving us, of course, cues and real information and connection. But it's not that it's only limited to what the Gita say, only limited to what the Bhagavatam say. All of those texts are trying to invite us to have an experiential connection with the divine, and then we will be beyond words in terms of what we will be experiencing. So
there's
and also I appreciate what you mentioned on non-duality, Jeff, because sometimes non-duality is taken very quickly as impersonal, so to say, and impersonal is taken as less than a person. Eventually the conclusion is we don't want non-duality. I will speak from my tradition, but actually when we study what the scriptures say, immediately again the Bhagavatam says Advaita Tattva, reality, God is non-dual consciousness. And many times non-duality, there are different ways of non-duality, of course, there are different approaches, but all mystical traditions, I will say agree on this foundational interconnectedness and union and undivided wholeness, if you want to put it that way, non-duality and on that foundation, different nuances of that can be expressed, different forms of diversity can be expressed on the foundation of non-duality or oneness, if you will. We have bed a bed. Our equation is one and different. So it's there. It's there.
And that's what I love, that the Achintya Bheda Veda of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. That it's so beautifully said, and inconceivable oneness and difference.
Yeah,
and they're achintya. We can't really think it. We have to.
It's paradoxical.
Experience it. Yeah, you have to experience it. And this is why I think some of the sages, and I think in my own tradition, Sri Ramakrishna, or if you think of the Buddha, sometimes they just lapse into silence. Sometimes the Buddha's reply to some questions was simply to not answer, and the silence was the reply. This is utterly beyond.
Yeah. And many times in the Gita and in other texts of our tradition, mauna or silence is very emphasized. And Krishna indeed in the Gita says, of all things that are secret, I am silence. Yeah. So that's another point. I mean, he himself is identifying with, he says, I am non-different from silence. Of all secrets, I am silence. That's very, very intriguing, very poetic. Like whatever is secret will be spoken, will be heard through silence. I manifest there. So it's again, it's not foreign to our own tradition either.
Yeah, not at all.
Yeah.
And love is often expressed through silence. I thinking of my grandmother, she wouldn't even have to say any words. You would just see in her face, the way she would look at you, you felt loved, right? And it was just, it was in her presence. And even words like I love you seem, sort of almost superficial at that point.
Yeah. Thank you for your thoughts on radical personalism. It's adding to my own experience of it. And since we talk about my first book, Inherent or Inherited, and somehow you have been involved in all my 3 books so far in one way or another. In my first book, you have been a very generous endorser. In relation to the second one, you have been a very we would have been an endorser, but it had no endorsement. So that's why you're not an endorser in that book, but you have been a very profound admirer and promoter and expander of the idea of radical personalism. And in connection to the third book that I'm almost finishing, you have been very kind to accept my invitation to write the preface to the book. So you are a prefacer of that book. Thank you so much for that. I'm publicly giving those news today.
All right.
And in connection to the topic of my third book, of course, we can go a little bit more deeper into this idea of, you already referred to process theology. Right. And we recently shared this nice conversation together in the process theology community. And of course, you already gave an overview of what's process theology about, and you have been talking about for a long time, and I appreciate that from the Hindu perspective, so to say, Sanatana Dharma traditions, how this idea can be embraced. So I'd like, if you have a few minutes, we can unpack a few notions apart from what you already mentioned in connection of the implications of conceiving reality as in process, as in constant expansion or evolution and interconnectedness. So one of the things, I have 4 thoughts in mind. Let's see if we can get there. Sure. One of those is God's connection, as you mentioned, with the world, God's awareness of people suffering, God somehow being involved in other people's lives. In other words, God not being impassible. No, this a little bit technical term that I'm invoking. So if you could share some thoughts in connection to your own take on God's absence of impassibility, so to say, and actually being deeply empathic in the context of being love, basically.
Right. Love. And in fact, radically personal, to use the phrase from your second book, right? Because my thinking on process, my introduction to it was through the work of Alfred North Whitehead. He's really sort of considered the grandfather of this school of thought in the West. I think there are analogs of process thought in Indian philosophy as well. There are aspects of it in Buddhism, especially Mahayana, and there are aspects of it in Vedanta, especially Vishishtadvaita has many commonalities with process thought. And the second thinker in the West, besides Whitehead, is a thinker named Charles Hartshorne, who was one of the teachers of my teacher, who from the Professor Gamwell, from whom I learned process thought. And so, very important thing that Hartshorne does, he also calls another term he uses for process theology, he calls it neoclassical theology. And what he means by that is the following. This is sort of classical Western theology, like Thomas Aquinas and so on that we were mentioning. It always emphasized, as you said, impassibility, eternity, God being utterly transcendent of time and space and causation. And the problem,
changeless, right?
Changeless, utterly changeless. The problem this leads to is that it's hard to connect that God with the God of the scriptures of any tradition, right? Because that God is relational, is involved in the world, is a person, and so Hartshorne's insight was that yes, there are aspects of the divine, you could say, we could call the essence of God is unchanging, right? That God is love, God cannot not be love, right? Just like we were saying earlier. So that is changeless. But all the things that would fall under that heading are we're talking in a fairly abstract way. He says there is also the actual reality of God. So what he called there is the divine, what he called the absolute, right, using classical terminology. But then he says there's the relative pole of the existence of God. God
Use
as
the expression dipolar, right? God as
dipolar, right, has an absolute pole and a relative pole. So there is that infinite, beyond time and space nature of God, but there is also a being, a personal being, whose, and this is Whitehead's terminology, whose existence is implicated with the existence of every being in the cosmos, right? That all of us exist by virtue of our relationality with this divine reality, right? The divine relativity. And so one way that Hartshorne rather, illustrates this really nicely, he says that when the classical theologians were talking about God being eternal, unchanging, they believed they were praising God, right? They called, Whitehead called paying metaphysical compliments to God. And it's kind of like what I was saying a little while ago about Advaita Vedanta, saying that, okay, we're going to emphasize that which is utterly changeless, utterly beyond, because things that are in the realm of time and space are imperfect, right? They can be destroyed and so on, and God can't be destroyed, right? So, but then Hartshorne gives this wonderful image. He says, imagine a poem being read to a person who knows the language in which the poem is written and knows all of its nuances and has an appreciation for poetry, right? They are going to be moved. They're going to be transformed by hearing that poem read. Then you imagine someone hearing the poem who knows the language, but they have no ear for poetry. So they're like, they understand what's being said, but it doesn't really touch them deeply. It's like, okay, yeah, that's about the river. Okay, fine. Then you have someone who hears the poem but does not know the language. They'll hear the music of the words. They might say, it sounds very beautiful. I don't know what it means, but it sounds nice. And they might even enjoy the experience on some level. Then he talks about the poem being read to a dog. And the dog does not understand the words at all. The dog might understand some of the intonation of the language, the voice going up and down, might even respond to it a little bit, maybe a wag his tail, but his consciousness is not being very deeply affected. And then he concludes with a glass of water. Right? The poem is being read to a glass of water. And what Hartshorne basically says is that the classical theologians, by making God completely unaffected by anything in the realm of time and space, are basically saying that God is more like a glass of water than a person enjoying a poem. And it's precisely the ability of the person enjoying the poem to be affected by it that makes their experience much richer and more profound and more of a contribution to the universe, right? That they've had this wonderful experience. And so our ability to be moved is really essential to our existence as the kind of beings we want to be. And then he's saying, how much more must that be true of God? So we're talking about a being who, yes, cannot be destroyed, but someone who is the ultimate appreciator of the poetry of the world, someone who is a being who is very deeply moved
Poetry himself.
by every deeply moved by every moment of suffering, by every moment of joy, and affected, right, on some level. And you quoted something really beautiful in our last talk with Sherry Kling, when you said that our love for Krishna makes Krishna even more beautiful, right? That we're contributing something back to divinity, so that the divinity is seen then as something that, yes, has an eternal and unchanging nature, but part of that nature is the ability to change and to be affected and to feel and experience. And so in process thought, God is called something like the co-sufferer with the world, right? David Griffin, another important process thinker, he talks about the traditional critique of theism, that God cannot be all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, because evil happens in the world, right? And so if evil happens in the world, if God is all-knowing, that means God knows about that evil. Well, that's fine. But if God is both all-powerful and all-good, this becomes difficult, because either God is doing these terrible things or letting them happen, or not, right? So Griffin opts for not. He says that all-powerful in the conventional sense of the word, meaning that we have no power at all the power rests with God. He actually rejects that. He says that we're the ones doing evil in the world. God's wanting us to do more, do better. Now, in both the Vaishnava and in the Advaita traditions of Vedanta, this raises a question, right? Because all power does ultimately rest with God, according to these traditions. But there is that sense in which we are also part of the divine reality. So it's not that we utterly lack any power. I mean, we are not really the true doers of action, but as long as we think we are, we're going to be making mistakes and causing problems in the world. And God doesn't sort of come down and stop that, right? It's part of the unfoldment of the lila, unfoldment of the divine play. But getting back to process, it's giving an intellectual foundation, kind of a metaphysical foundation, for the idea that you can have an entity with a changeless essence, but who nevertheless changes with the universe, and even expands in a certain sense, right? There is this term used in process thought of God being self-surpassing, right? No being is greater than God, except God. God can become even more, because with each moment, all of these experiences are being absorbed and felt and drawn into the divine actuality.
Yeah, thank you. So many points you mentioned that I like to unpack a little bit more. Where to begin? Oh my gosh. Yeah, of course, we are on the same page, and I appreciate what you mentioned. And yeah, I'm writing a whole book on that now, on how love is ever evolving by nature. In one sense, as you say, it has its changeless side. Love is always love, and love is always evolving, and that's what's changeless about love. And God being love, that applies to him as well. And we are under the shelter of love, and God has that similar ever-evolving potential. And material energy in its own way is in evolution and in unfolding, and it's not as inert as we may think. So I'm trying to dedicate one part of the book to each one of them: love, God, soul, and matter. So I appreciate one of the first points you mentioned in terms of the interconnectivity of everything, and the importance of seeing all of reality, which was the word that implicated. Yeah, God is implicated in all of reality, like Whitehead mentioned. And we have the term sambandha in Sanskrit, which basically means that sam means everything, bandha means bonded or connected. So sambandha basically means everything. It was just implicated. Everything is connected with this common center, and that's for us the basic foundational knowledge for us to have an education on to how to proceed in bhakti, how to proceed in practice in life, starting with that idea, that education, that nothing exists in its own orbit, so to say. Like there are not two isolated realities, going back to non-dual thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, when I was writing this book, I was thinking, I'm trying to write the book. For me, it's a very fascinating idea to talk about this and to open my head and my heart and my mind and everything to the possibility of changelessness and a foundation, but on that foundation, ever unfolding, ever evolving patterns, like spiral dynamics, so to say.
Yes.
But also I feel that for some people that may create some fear or some anxiety, the notion that everything is in constant movement and evolution, because we are so drawn again to security, to safety, to predictability. We don't want things out of control. Again,
Right.
It's difficult for us to surrender to an unpredictable flow that love is actually. So one of my main concerns, and you let me know whenever you go through the material when I will send it you, but I'm trying to let, hopefully that the people who read the book does not end up being terrified and paranoid and freaking out, because this is too much movement, too much too much evolution. I want things to be more predictable. As we were talking before, when some people tries to bring all of them to their own tradition, it may seem such a strong faith, but actually they have such a fearful, insecure situation that they need all of them thinking like them. So this is kind of a variety of that. I'm insecure, I'm fearful, I don't want things to change and evolve. I want predictability. And I can empathize if people have gone through some complicated chapters in their life and they need a few things in place. I'm not all for chaos. Order also balances chaos, but I know what you think about.
Well, and this is a very valid point. I have a friend who's a Christian process thinker. He gave a sermon which was informed by process. He talked about God as the fellow sufferer with all of us. And one of his parishioners came up afterward and was very angry. He said, "What good does that do me?" Right? He wants a God who is completely outside and above the fray, that he can then say, "Okay, here at least is one place where I can go that is completely free from suffering, completely free from all of that." And I have to say, one of the things that drew me to an Advaitic perspective early on was the idea that all the suffering, all of the things that I was going through with my father was in some sense not real, right? This whole idea of Maya, right? That it's not fully really real. The true reality is something beyond that. And so, I think this is why I think it's that idea that there is the absolute pole in the dipolar nature of God, which is there, and that doesn't change, and that, like I said, it's like it's a love that, because it's love, it's relational, it's dynamic. There's a sense of change, but that its fundamental existence doesn't go away. Because otherwise people will feel insecure. It's like, the idea that God weeps for you is beautiful, but on the other hand, the idea that God weeps for you, and then now you have to console God somehow, right? that would disturb people, right? But this is a source of infinite strength, not. But that part of that strength is a very profound understanding of what we're experiencing, and that God knows us even better than we know ourselves, and so feels that suffering even to a greater depth than we're even aware.
Yeah. And if we learn to present this topic, like, for example, you were referring this idea of, okay, Krishna is becoming every time more beautiful by receiving the love of his devotees. Properly understood, that's a charming, at least for me, a charming prospect, to relate to a person that is always increasing its charm and beauty, and one can increase one's love in service to that beauty, and so on and so forth, and both of them engaged in a competition where none of the parts accept defeat, as we will say.
Yes.
So there's a charm to that prospect, so to say. So hopefully we can do some justice to the theme and the topic and present it in a way that is charming. That with this idea, of course.
Exactly. Charming, not threatening, right? Charming.
Yeah, exactly. So, Jeff, wrapping up one more topic I'd like to bring to the table. We have a few more minutes. Sure. You have written various books, edited others, I think 11 in total, if I'm not mistaken, and most focused on Hinduism, or all of them probably. Some months ago, I was in New Jersey, and I went from New York to a Rath Yatra, which is this chariot festival that is originally made in Jagannath Puri, but replicated in other parts of the globe. So we were in a big festival. And in the midst of 3,000 Gaudiya Vaishnavas, I met with Satyaraj Prabhu, Stephen Rosen.
Yes.
We have a very nice conversation then on the park, like for an hour or so.
Oh,
and
excellent.
at one point of the conversation, it came the topic that we were friends, that we were talking, and he told me, I'm about to publish a book with Jeffery.
Yes, that's right.
on Ahimsa, right?
Ahimsa, right. Ahimsa and the Indic traditions. Yes.
Yeah. So I would like to invite you to share a few words on the topic of Ahimsa, because of course it's a very pervading theme throughout all the Sanatan Dharma, so to say, scope. Ahimsa meaning non-violence,
Yes.
or as I like to say sometimes, because in our tradition, for example, when the moment of initiation comes, in some lineages, at least in some groups, we have something called the 4 regulative principles or 4 commitments, and one of them is sometimes translated as not meat eating, so to say. But I try generally to expand from that, as I did in Radical Personalism. Is actually non-meat eating is just an example of the whole principle. It's not about not meat eating, it's about being vegetarian, and it's not only about being vegetarian, it's about being non-violent.
Yes.
Not only regarding the diet, but also it's not about being non-violent, but it's still, by saying non-violent, we are saying it in a negative way.
Right.
Of course, Ahimsa is a yama in the yoga tradition, which is one of the restrictions, so one of the don'ts. So don't be violent, but also I will try to expand that further to the idea of what's the positive explanation of that, which is be loving, be compassionate. And you ultimately, it's not only just be loving and compassionate, but be as loving and as compassionate as you can.
Yes.
For me, that's the full unpacking of that idea that it originally began with don't eat meat.
Right.
Between that and be as compassionate, as loving as you can, there's a huge gap.
But that's the deeper principle underlying. And whenever I talk about Ahimsa and write about it, I like to emphasize that even the word nonviolence is not quite adequate for it, right? It's for those who love Sanskrit grammar, this Ahimsa is what's called a desiderative, right? That is, it is expressing a desire. Ahimsa is not even wanting to cause harm to any living being, and it's always emphasized in all the traditions, Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain, nonviolence in thought, word, and action. So not even thinking aggressive thoughts toward another being, not speaking in a way that's harmful or hurtful, and certainly not acting in ways that are hurtful. So, and I like the way you sort of,
and even to oneself, right? Because sometimes it can be limited to other people, but there has to be a proper self-love, if you will.
That's right. And in fact, in the Theravada Buddhist tradition, there's this wonderful meditation called the meditation on loving kindness, metta, it's called in Pali, and that you start with yourself. With that meditation, you experience love for yourself, and then you expand that to the beings in your environment, and then eventually to all the beings in the world. And I like how you connected with the nonviolence with love, because yes, if we phrase it positively, well, what does it mean to not wish harm to any being? Well, it means wishing them to thrive, for them to be well, for them to be happy, for them to reach moksha. Right? This is. So it's love in its essence. Another tradition I've written on a bit is the Jain tradition, and Jains have often been accused of having a negative ethic. Oh, it's about avoiding harm, but what about actually helping beings? Well, Jains created the first animal hospitals in the world in ancient times in India. They Jain teachers consistently emphasize this, that to really practice ahimsa means to practice love for all beings and to contribute to the welfare of all beings. And so it's a big theme of the tradition. Now, of course, differences arise about what that means in practice, and there are discussions about things like euthanasia and so on. For Jains would be completely opposed to that, whereas some people would say that would be more compassionate. But as you were saying about the meat-eating vow, right? It's the underlying principle. What is the motive behind our action? It should come from compassion. And
something that comes to mind in that connection that I refer briefly in my first book when I address Ahimsa in connection to Satyam, the second yama in the Yoga Sutra, and somehow the point is, generally, at least some of the criterion to interpret the prominence or the importance of a particular text or section is evaluated according to the beginning statement sometimes, like whatever is mentioned first or sometimes last, but not generally second, third, or fourth. So whatever begins with is the most important. So and most commentators of the Yoga Sutras have mentioned that among all yamas, Ahimsa is the most important, and somehow leads the list of whatever follows after that. So and after Ahimsa comes Satyam, which is again truthfulness, if you will. But interestingly, if first comes Ahimsa, the idea will be you have to be truthful, but in a way that is not harmful to others. No, because sometimes you can use the truth or speak something that is objectively true, a fact, but in a way that is not in line with Ahimsa. No, like the famous example that, I don't know, a person is escaping from some thieves, and the person runs by, and a person sees that person running, and then the thieves come and ask that other person, did you see a person running? And the person realizes what's going on, but he's truthful and says, yeah, he went there, you can get him there. And that
Right.
that won't end up in Ahimsa, basically, you know. So the point that when truth produces violence, that shouldn't be allowed. So I think that's also a nuanced, interesting way of addressing the principle of Ahimsa.
I'm really happy to hear you say that, because I one of my criticisms of a lot of what happens on social media is precisely this. People are speaking, well, they're not all speaking truth, but you could say, to be charitable, they're speaking their truth, right? They're speaking truth as they see it, but often in a very aggressive, demeaning way to other people. And this is why I'm not really very active on social media, or less than I used to be, because there's just so much of it is aggression and
entitlement,
and also thinking, especially when people post something under a pseudonym, then they think, okay, now I have free reign to, say all kinds of aggressive things. Karma's still there, right? It's not, they have not fooled God. They have not fooled the universe by doing that, and it's sometimes disheartening, but it's also, I mean, it's the internet's such a wonderful tool. I mean, you have this podcast, right? It's such a wonderful tool for sharing truth in a spirit of ahimsa, right? And there are a lot of wonderful places like this that are there, which is why I still engage with these things.
Hopefully, yeah. Thank you, Jeffrey, for joining us. And I don't know if, just to conclude, you have any final words, thoughts, whatever you may like to share before we put our conversation to rest today. Only for today. It's ongoing.
Only for today. That's right. Yeah. Only my gratitude to you for inviting me here, and I've thoroughly enjoyed our dialogue. And again, for me, it's just one episode, and it's one episode of your podcast, but also one episode in our ongoing conversation. So thank you.
Thanks so much for coming, and hopefully, to continue our next episode of our podcast and of our live podcast.
Yes.
In another session. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for tuning in to the Free Radical podcast. It has been a wonderful conversation, dialogue with Dr. Jeffery Lang. Very deep, very friendly, very profound, very broad, very new perspectives coming to my life personally. I hope to yours as well. So if you enjoy our conversation, again, please support us by subscribing to the channel, clicking the bell. Your likes, your comments, your shares help the conversation to remain as ongoing as it should be forever, hopefully. And we can continue these discussions for the benefit of all. And as usually, whatever you have touched your heart today, whatever has made your heart beat and resonate and vibrate in a very unique way, gave you a new perspective, gave you a new angle, gave you a new sense of insight, please don't keep it with you. Try to integrate by processing, by walking your talk, but also by extending the gift to others. There's so much need for gifts like this extended to all of us. So we are all part of this project. So hopefully, if you want to pay us, if you would like to pay it back, just pay it forward in that particular way, extending the gift to wherever you walk and living your life as a gift. So thanks so much for your time. and presence, and see you in 2 weeks for our next episode of the Free Radical Podcast.